Good morning. Happy Monday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. Coming off a great weekend. Looking forward to this week. And we got a squat question for today, for Monday. So let's dig right into that. This comes from Dan. And Dan asks, how does one visually distinguish between an anterior compression halting a squat or a compression above the level of the trochanter? So you're talking about the posterior aspect of the pelvis, halting a squat in the sticking point zone. So we get to talk about the sticking point, and then we're going to be able to break down a squat. And I've got some visual representations of some things that should help you with this, because it is easy to see once you understand what you're looking at. Okay, so let's talk about this sticking point thing first. So the sticking point is traditionally defined as a range somewhere around 90 degrees of hip flexion plus or minus 30 in the literature. And so it does tend to show up consistently in this area. The reason being, in my opinion, and from the model's perspective, is that this is where we have to produce the highest level of force. So through this middle range, so this is actually where we internally rotate, so it's the highest force producing range that we would have in a squat. And so what happens as far as like pelvic diaphragm is concerned, we have to be able to push the pelvic diaphragm upward through this range, because that's going to be required to create the pelvic orientation that gives us the internal rotation and therefore the propulsive strategy into the ground to propel through the squat. If we can't overcome, if we can't produce enough force through that pelvic diaphragm, we're not going to capture our IR, and we're going to reverse gears and we're going to fall right to the bottom of the squat, unless you superimpose some form of compressive strategy on top of that, which is what we're going to talk about. So Dan was asking about the difference between a compressive strategy posteriorly here and a compressive strategy anteriorly here. And so let's talk about the ER versus IR thing for just a minute. What I want you to understand is that the internal rotation and external rotation are superposed upon one another. And so we also have to start to expand our viewpoint that this is not a straight plane of motion ever, never was, and there is no arc. What we're looking at is this 4D representation of where we would seek and find internal and external rotation available to us by position and by shape and by orientation of the pelvis. So when we have this posterior compression, we know we're going to lose external rotation through the typical ranges of motion, and it's demonstrated very easily through this hip flexion measure, which makes it nice when we're doing table tests and things. But when we're performing an activity in 4 dimensions, as we would say with a barbell back squat, now we got to start identifying where these external rotations and internal rotations are going to arise. Okay, so if I'm lacking external rotation, so I've got the posterior compressive strategy here, I know I lose my ER. So what it's going to look like when they squat is you're going to see an early deviation of the knees outward. And so this is going to be before they hit 90 degrees. So everything will look all fine and wonderful. And then they start to enter this sticking point region with this plus or minus 30 degrees from 90 kind of a thing. And then you'll start to see the knees deviate outward, and they'll continue to do so until they hit about 90 degrees. Now, real quick, anything above 90 degrees probably is an external rotation. It's going to be an IR substitution. That's a different story. We can come back to that later. But what I wanted you to see is, like, you're going to see the knees deviate when you have the lack of ER as you're approaching the sticking point. Now, the second question is, what happens when we have the anterior compression? So we have an anterior compressive strategy. Okay, so we're anterior here. Now we're going to lose hip internal rotation. So this is really important, because think about this. We have to propel into the ground to finish our squat. So we're going to figure out some way to do it. If I can't access internal rotation at the hip, I'm going to create internal rotation somewhere else. Typically what we're going to see is we're going to see that internal rotation compensatory strategy above the pelvis. More often than not, what you're going to see is you're going to see this compressive strategy in the posterior lower thorax, like the lowest ribs. So we're actually going to see what would be considered traditional extension moving forward, probably through like the T11, 12 region, and you're going to see the compression of those lower ribs. And so again, this is the compensation for internal rotation, because all we have to do is get force into the ground some way, shape, or form. If I can't do it at the hip, I will do it somewhere else. Now, so if we see these things and we don't like them and we want to make a change, the easiest strategy to overcome these issues is to move people back towards early propulsion. And so this becomes a heels elevated squat variation. And so you can progressively move from, say, a heels elevated goblet squat, some form of front squat, and then maybe eventually a back squat again. But again, we want to move that orientation back towards early propulsion. The other strategies that you might use in a split squat variation, so these are your front foot elevated strategies that you might use any number of different ways. You could use like just the heel elevated or the front foot elevated, depending on the needs of the individual. But that would be, again, the easiest strategy, moving back towards early. But hopefully this gives you an idea, Dan, as to what you're looking at as these people are moving through space and performing their squat. Start thinking in 4 dimensions, not 2. It's not an arc. It's all the way around. So we're going to find ERs and IRs in many different places based on the shape and the orientation of the pelvis and the hip. You guys have a great day. I will see you tomorrow.